Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Edge podcast. On this specific episode, we'll be talking about podcast strategies, or how can you as a business owner and entrepreneur use podcasting to grow your influence, your brand, and ultimately your business. So I'm going to be having that conversation with an expert and founder of Campfire Studios, Will Fleming, who specializes in video and podcasting production. Well, brother, thank you for jumping on this podcast today. I'm excited. I'm excited.
100%.
Before we get into it, what is something interesting about yourself that you can share that people don't normally know about? Something interesting.
Oh, man. We're going deep into the archives. I grew up not really knowing how to read. I think it was dyslexia. I've since kind of hacked my system to be able to teach me, using internet and whatnot. But I, as a youngster, really struggled to read. So I would memorize the teacher telling me the words on a book, and then I would pretend to read it back. But I can distinctly remember just it not adding up. And what that did is it gave me this skill set of being able to essentially manipulate people through my spoken word, right? Because I had to try and get you to help me, or I was going to not make it through the kind of junior school. Another thing is that I grew up loving Superman, the 1980s films with Christopher Reeve, and it wasn't Superman, it was Clark Kent. I liked the humble nature. I liked that he was the true character, but he was faking this other confident Superman character. So yeah, man, it's influenced me a lot, and as a visual person, that has been my life, relying on my visual side to help me navigate the world.
I love that. I think they go hand in hand. You discovered something, a dyslexia, that's a little bit of I wouldn't say a weakness, but it wasn't a strength, reading and all of that, but you found another way. So it's kind of like Superman, right? You discovered your superpower or found another way to leverage.
That's right.
Leverage something. So,
and unlike Superman, though, he was forced into the spotlight, right? His planet blew up. I had lots of, I guess you'd call it privilege in today's world, where I had a family who was around. I had older brothers and sisters who carved a path for me. So I kind of had to develop later, like right into my 30s, trying to work out, who am I? What is this power that I have, if we're talking kind of Superman stuff, and how do I leverage it? And I've only really taken the full leap to turn into Superman, if we're going to continue that path, March this year, 2023, when I went full-time into Campfire Studios. It's a leap of faith.
That's awesome. Yeah, you're a Superman yourself, especially with the work that you're doing. You're helping other people bring to life their vision and their brand, and their influence through podcasting, which we would love to learn more about.
Absolutely.
But tell us a little bit about yourself, just a little brief intro, and how did you end up in podcasting?
I mean, I'm not here if my mum doesn't migrate to New Zealand from the Cook Islands in the early 50s, 60s. That's a story in itself, like she's the youngest of 5 brothers and sisters. They come across to New Zealand because my grandfather's building the harbour bridge, right, with a bunch of other engineers from the Cooks, and they try and live the New Zealand dream, which was to get a full-time job, to buy a house and whatnot. And of course, we know in society all of the other problems that have come along with it, but these were really brave people who left their villages to come and live in this world which they didn't understand. It's quite, talk about the Superman journey. These are superheroes, right? They left their own lands. One thing I always think, though, is that they probably never anticipated that the kids would lose that identity. And that's something I struggle with. I'm trying to relearn who is that part of my culture. My mum thought it was a good idea to raise me like a Kiwi. And maybe that worked until the world realized that actually we need an Indigenous voice. So that's partly the reason why I do what I do today, to help kind of, not everything can be a PowerPoint and a presentation. Some things have to be spoken, So that's kind of part of the story. I think I had a happy childhood growing up as a kid in the 80s who really probably identified more with my Pākehā side. you know. So that's a challenge I have now, is like, what are those two sides? But because I was a visual person, that led me down, you know, making videos and all that kind of stuff. I worked at TVNZ for a while doing editing, and TV3 and Sky, but I had my eye on something more meaningful. And I really mean that critically. I don't think our traditional media industries are meaningful. I think they work to a massive Google-type algorithm. It's a monster that needs to be fed, and I think that's good for certain things, but it's definitely not good for other things. One of those things it's not good for is like, who are you? What do you care about? How do we amplify that as more people go on social media? So, yeah, about 5 years ago, I found myself wanting to move away from that big industry, and that was tough, you know, because none of my colleagues thought about backing people to have regular conversations. But I was catching the bus to work every day. Where were we? East Auckland, catching the bus into, you know, the city to work at TVNZ, and I was like, man, this is a long drive, and it's boring. And I Googled, what can you do on a bus? That was probably longer ago, maybe 10 years ago. And the word podcast came up, and I just got hooked, you know. All the podcasts that were around then, there was no video podcast. It was only audio podcasts because data on your phone was still too expensive. And that became my life, listening to these conversations. And I thought, I can do that. So I started it as a hobby. And probably in my podcast career, I've maybe done about 400 podcasts.
Wow.
Just different types of interviews, and in person and Zoom.
That's
and
amazing.
Some of those still live online. Others I've archived. You know, I still podcast as an amateur today. But I never thought that skill set of doing something 400 times would give me a real superpower in terms of being able to know how to create a podcast and to guide people's energy, right? Like, if you say lights and camera to somebody, most people will be like, ooh, I don't want to be on that. But if you say, man, we're just going to have a cool, authentic, genuine conversation, most people are like, oh, I can dig that. And that's my definition of a podcast. It's like today. There's no high stakes. It's just us connecting for an awesome chat.
I love that. I love that. It gives meaning behind what podcasting is, a different perspective. So it's not anxious and scary for a lot of people, right? Like, I got to perform, I got to show, you know, prove myself. But not all superheroes wear capes is what I'm hearing. And I love that you started off with mum and your parents, acknowledging them, and they did their best for you. Absolutely. And, you know, growing up, you kind of learned a little bit more about yourself. And like Superman, he has his kryptonites, you know, his weaknesses, but at the same time, he has his strengths, and you leveraged the visual and audio side of things as well. And that's kind of cool that you were on a bus, and obviously you're a bit, you know, I think all of us get that moment sometimes where we're just like, you know, we're working a job or just living life, and then all of a sudden we're like, you know, there's got to be more.
Absolutely.
You know, there's got to be more than this. And that's kind of sounded like the pivoting or part of your journey where it kind of steered you into podcasting. Absolutely. And I've seen a lot of your awesome mahi online. I've seen the podcasting that you've done for other people as well. And it's professional. I mean, even myself, I did my podcasting with you, you know, and your studio, everything is amazing, you know. So I know the amazing work that you're doing. Thanks, I know that there's meaning. You're genuine behind it. You know, it comes from the heart. You do want people to connect. Yeah. And you do want them to share their stories.
I mean, 100% plus the idea that I think we're not having enough conversations. There's not enough space in our world, in our modern society, which encourages people from all walks of life to chat. You know, like, there is no, the bubble was established during COVID, but the bubble has been there for a while, where we don't know our neighbours anymore. You know, we don't feel safe enough to play on the streets. It's not that stuff that's the problem. There's no chats anymore. And so I think part of what I'm doing is encouraging people to have an awesome chat with someone they may not know very well without a high stakes need. You know, if you go to a business meeting or a government thing, you better stay on topic and you better deliver your KPIs, or everyone's going to be annoyed at you. But in a podcast studio, you can say, hey, you know, why? You know, or, oh, that's an interesting point. how'd you get to that? You know, I couldn't have imagined that we'd be talking about Superman as a metaphor. And if we were sitting here representing, you know, education, for example, we might feel the pressure to stick to that kaupapa, right? But, you know, the other thing that cracks me up, because it's so in plain sight hidden, is when you look what the government strategy is for mental health, for example, there's two pillars. One is SSRI or antidepressant, right? And that correlates with some, I guess, other counselling and stuff like that. The other side is what they call talk therapy, which is talking, which is unloading the burden that you feel. And when you go to counselling, that's exactly what happens, even though people don't quite know, you know, there's a stigma around counselling, but the general idea is that you will get out what you're holding in. And I'm like, yeah, but podcasting does that. So we should be incentivizing more chats, you know, for more people, low stakes environments where we chat just like today.
I love that. I love that. And, you know, it should feel like a safe space, and it should be a conversation.
Yeah.
You know, not, I mean, like, this is an interview. I mean, there is a few questions in that was pre-planned, but for the most part, it's a conversation. It's you and I connecting, and people who listen on this podcast feel like they're joining the conversation.
Absolutely.
They're listening on it, right?
That's the genius, because there's an extra incentive. You know, we know that there will be people watching and listening. And that's cool, because there is that ego part of us. But why can't it be a win-win-win, where me and you connect, we get to look in each other's eyes, we get to chat, we get to build a deeper relationship, we get to get stuff off our chest, and that is classified as content, which is very valuable in today's world, in a business sense, you know. I mean, every young person is being manipulated to spend more time on screen, and that is through content. You know, and regardless if it's good or bad, there is a lot of interest in people creating good content. I also think that's why people are interested in podcasting, because standard content, and my critique on traditional media is it's not fair if you have the best writers, the best lighting, the best microphones, you're looking at camera and reading a script, but it looks like you're not. That's not real life. That's not real life. And maybe in the past when you played with other friends or you met up with people, that's real life, and you could have a balance of knowing that this other thing was just a portion of life. But now everything is made to look like it's real life. But, you know, if you watch the news, there's a team of 50 behind that one person looking at camera and looking awesome and sounding awesome and delivering perfect sentences. It's a team of 50. That's how much it takes. Probably more, because I work there, you know, and they're good people. But we don't know as general public that all of that magic is going on. So it makes us feel like, oh, why can't I have a deep chat, you know? Well, maybe it's because we don't know that, and this is something else. But it is real life, you know. I can't anticipate what I'll say. We have to trust each other that, you know, you'll ask good questions and I'll give good answers, and that's fair, and I like that.
Yeah, I love that. I think, it does. I mean, you've come from a really rich experience and background where you've worked with big production teams, and there's a lot of work behind the scenes that create art and magic. And people just see the fruits of it, the video, and think it's, you know. But it doesn't have to be that complicated, right? And that technical for entrepreneurs or business owners who might want to start small.
Absolutely.
Podcasting doesn't have to be this big thing. I guess from your perspective, or, you know, what advice can you give around someone who's thinking about starting a podcast? Where can they start with not having to spend too much or spend too much time setting up?
So people won't like this answer, but it's the correct one. You have to, the hierarchy should be conversation first. So whether or not it's you sitting down with someone you like for a chat and telling yourself you're training for podcasts, do that. Because if you make it about the technical stuff first, which people do fall into the trap, that hole is endless. If you make it like where that's the rubric or the measurement, you're up against Avatar, you know? You're up against TVNZ, a team of 50. They'll always win the technical race. There's too many buttons to push and things to manage, and I'm sure you can appreciate the amount of chaos that you make by having a setup. And this is only the recording. There's not even touched on the editing bit and the distribution and the marketing. So it's like everything. It's very, very complex, but the chat's not. But that is the gold. If you have the best looking stuff, but your content is not interesting, then you haven't delivered on your original idea. So I'd say get used to chatting first. Most people have scaled up in terms of, we had to Zoom for work. So we've probably got a laptop or some device that we can connect. That's how I would start it. Zoom conversations where all you do is push record. And then your job is to make your content the best, knowing that your technical isn't going to make you feel like you're a podcaster, but your talking will. So what is a podcast? Is it like this one where there's a bit of music and then it goes into an intro? Well, how do you do that? If you start Googling free editing softwares, you'll go down that rabbit hole. Or you could just say, okay, I'm going to talk with a friend and we're going to do a 20-minute podcast about a really rich topic which we're experts in. And there's going to be nothing else than just that. Are you ready to go? Yep. Record. Hey, everyone, welcome to this podcast. I'm here with my friend. Boom, in. And I'd say that will be 1, really fun, 2, really sustainable. Try 10 of those. And if you still really love it, then say, let's get some better mics. Then do another 10. Then if you still really love it, let's get some cameras. By the way, if you get to 20 podcasts, you enter the 1% of podcasters worldwide. Like 1%, because most podcasts don't get past something like episode 3 or 6, because it's that hard to keep every week. And people's desire for content, go on YouTube. There's content being uploaded every millisecond. And if you want to hit that game, you better be regular. So the only way you're going to be regular is if you just frame it all around your chat, connecting on the deepest level you can about a topic you love. So those are the questions to be writing down. What do I love to talk about? Who do I love to talk about that with? Boom, that's your podcast.
I love that. See, it doesn't have to be too technical. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get fancy technology, cameras. Like you said, you can just jump on Zoom, hit the record button if you know how to use Zoom, and you got your video and your audio straight away, and you just start there. But I like what you said. Don't get distracted by all the flashy cameras and all of that. Like, start simple but focus predominantly on the conversation, the rich conversations, keeping it authentic,
100%.
Providing value to people,
Yeah.
You could have all the coolest gears, but then people watch the video or listen to it and it just doesn't provide any value. It's boring.
Yep.
So I guess what's some advice around that? That's some really good advice there. And obviously, there's different tiers, and if you've got a little bit more money, you can, afford that, or you can go to an external source like yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe talk about that as an alternative as well.
Well, I thought, just to lastly revisit that point, it might sound a bit odd that I'm saying don't worry about the gear, yet I've got all this awesome gear in a studio, right? But there was, when I first started podcasting, I was using old SingStar microphones, SingStar PlayStation 2 microphones that I worked out how to connect USB to an old laptop, and I was just recording audio. That was my beginning. And what I liked is driving to people and setting up this little thing, and then having these chats, and I'd have to tell them, please bring the mic really close to your mouth because they're not good microphones and they really need you to be right up. And so that was funny. And they were like, are these SingStar microphones? And I was like, yep. So it truly isn't about that. But if you do stick at it, you will build up your gear just by default. You can't help do that. And if it's under a business sense, you have an incentive. These can be, I guess, taxable items and whatnot. And also to be controlling your content and your guests, this, that is a really powerful thing. Because I'd say you get to network when you podcast, and when you build that strong relationship with a potential client or a client, it's a win-win, plus you have content for the internet. But just, quickly about Campfire Studios. So I think it was born, I mentioned that my family really protected me, and I struggle with this because I know that's not the story of many people. So I'm not sitting here saying, oh, I was too protected. But you can be too protected. You can be wrapped up in cotton wool and you're not that useful because you haven't got the resilience yet. The opposite is also true, right? Which is like it can be too tough and then you're hurt in a different way. You have traumas in a different way. But for me, I had so much optimism because I was wrapped up that it was hurtful to see the world through the true lens, which is like there are inequities. There's trauma at all levels. There's racism. There's things that happen outside of my own bubble that is so horrific. You don't know how to process that. And so, for years I just tried to say, oh, well, I'll just do a good job at what I do and, go to work like everybody else. But, that's not just what you have to do. That's what I knew. My family are workers. No one had businesses. So that's what took me so long to head down towards a business route because I knew nothing else, But there's mental health struggles when you have a bad manager, for example. I had a bad manager and I wasn't used to people lying on my behalf. I hadn't experienced that type of stuff before, so it hit me double as hard. And I just thought, man, I won't make it through if I've got people with nefarious angles. And I'm a real open person, and I never anticipated that would rub people the wrong way, because I was the one building a relationship. And I thought it was very logical. I'm there to video someone, and I need to have a strong rapport with them so they trust me, so that they feel comfortable with me on camera. But that wasn't translating. It was like, maybe seen as rogue or something like that, but I still disagree with that. However, that spooked me and that gave me the feeling, no. If this is going to work, if I'm going to this is the skill sets I have, this is my story, it's only going to work kind of on my terms. And so that's why, I put steps in place to build Campfire Studios, to start podcasting, to show that we had something there. So I teamed up with a very good filmmaker friend, Guy Pigden, and he doesn't really love people. He loves technical, and I really love people, and I don't really love technical. So we're a yin-yang. And that's one of the gifts in life, is if you can find someone to partner up with, just like if you can have a really strong relationship, you're gold. If you can find a strong relationship in business, you're gold. And that's really tricky, There's lots of egos at play. But that's like luck, and if you're lucky, you get that kind of relationship. So, yeah, for the last couple of years, we've been, trying to build clients, trying to get closer to work out how can we be the podcast studio that helps produce, government podcasts, and trying to train people of influence and people with deep pockets that not everything needs to be run through a comms team. That your true PR is if you connect with somebody about something you love. And we can always edit the bits out, but you'd be surprised how often people are like, oh no, that bit where I talk about that thing, leave it in. Because that's true. That gives context. And maybe in a short 30-second clip, that sounds out of context. But in a 1 hour conversation, beauty comes out, and you have to have that good with the bad. And I think everyone agrees but when the stakes are high, we only want to have the good. Well, I just am a strong advocate that that's not enough. If you are someone of privilege and influence and power, it's your job to share the true story,
But I love the story of Campfire Studios. I love the journey. It reminds me of my experience. I worked, my background's corporate and marketing and sales, and I had a pretty bad experience with a particular person, a boss, which motivated me to kind of go off on my own and start off, go all in on my business is education. And
Awesome.
I'm glad that that experience happened, even
Me
though
too.
it was rough.
Yeah.
Otherwise, education wouldn't be where it is today, all in. And so it's pretty cool to hear that Campfire Studios kind of started, that's a story.
Yeah.
The origins there, and you teamed up with your mate, the yin, the yang.
Yep.
And you got people skills. You're good at connecting with people. And I've seen it on the podcast and on videos. And it takes an art to make that happen, right? So it's not easy. How do you do that? How do you keep a conversation on a podcast authentic and make people feel comfortable? What are some tips for people who are interviewing and they don't make it a bit rough or transactional and put their guest in an uncomfortable space? How do you create that safe space?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to really try, and it's odd, eh? When we talk to kids, we talk this way. You have to listen. Or, if you imagine talking to kids, what's the point in listening, kids? So you can hear what they're saying. Well, it's the same in a podcast, and adults get used to filling the dead space or the quiet because they feel like they have to keep saying stuff. You must have had coffees with people and they just won't be quiet because they're worried it will reveal something about them. But a podcast only works if it's two-way street because there's never enough questions on a sheet. It has to be a conversation. And I don't know, I don't want to go maybe I do want to go deep, but I don't want to put people off. But there was research done on having conversations with people, right? And when you talk to somebody, it's more than just a connection. There is a heart rate that starts syncing up. And this is really deep human stuff. I thought that was so interesting that we don't even know that happens when you chat, that your heart rate starts sinking, and you can imagine that if you're in a relationship with somebody, that stuff's really important. But I would argue it's important with your business connections, with your friends. And I don't know if the research ever said, do heart rates sync up when you're doing a Zoom? Maybe not. And so we might be playing with something a lot deeper and a lot more ancient than we know. And actually, if you break down the word talanoa, for example, which I learned through podcasting, and this is just my interpretation from what I learned, the tala or the talk part is maybe what we in the West think, it's just the talk. But there's a whole noa part, which, as it was explained to me, is a balance or a coming to zero. And so I like that idea that a conversation needs to find balance or come to harmony. And I think that having a chat with somebody, how in mental health people say, just chat with a mate, check in. It's not enough to say that. You've got to maybe say, like the word talanoa, you've got to check in and have a conversation that reaches a state of harmony. It's just we're a little bit shy to talk like that to people. So cloak it in a podcast, start a podcast. And you can have these deep, amazing conversations that, truly connect. And I think that's what I'm trying to show through the body of work we're creating is look what happens when you bring people together. And I think that's very valuable, and I think it's very needed in our modern society where those algorithms are going to make us more predictable. And that's not a good thing. That's a great thing for algorithm, so it can sell us something. But we're not predictable, and we need to have space to be able to explore that and to move within that. And as long as we know we're here to have a talk where the goal is to bring harmony, we can have fun with that.
I love that. That's some good perspective there, especially with the talanoa, and just focusing on having a conversation, a nice conversation.
Yep.
Like I said, one of the coolest things I've ever heard before that kind of helps give me a bit of ease when I'm presenting or public speaking or anything. I can't remember where I heard this from, but the statement was, don't focus on presentation, focus on conversation. So, if you think less about presenting, you think less about having to perform and prove yourself. But if it's a conversation, you're listening, you're talking, it's two-way.
That's right.
You're not trying to sell or force something or persuade someone. It's just a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it's good for business owners or entrepreneurs out there to have that mindset. It's like whether you have a conversation with a client, or with mum and dad, or with family or friends, it's the same when it's on a podcast as well. It's just a conversation with another person. You're just wanting to connect and learn and share.
I know, 100%. And we have practices for that, but they somehow got confused. Like I'm sure the kava bowl was supposed to be a conversation starter. But from my analysis, it starts to symbolize the kava bowl, but that was only a surrogate, I think, to bring the conversation, to encourage the chat, to have a hierarchy-free zone where we all sit on low and we look at each other in the eye. And I'm sure there was more spaces like that, more time to be a young person with an elder, for example. That hardly ever happens apart from babysitting now. But that's a good service to family. But so was sharing stories. That's part of the work we do. We go into schools and we encourage students to research an elder in their community and then conduct a podcast. And it's beautiful because most adults would say, oh, kids don't have anything to say. They're all addicted to their social media, which is true because we invented social media so that they could be addicted to it. But there's also, they do have something to say. And when they are engaged with the person sitting across from them and they're an elder and they have a story, the wisdom gets passed on. And so, I hope to make some impact in that space, to be able to have a qualification where young students can podcast and get credits for it.
I love that. So obviously you've highlighted and given a great example around the power of podcasting, what it can do for people and how it can connect people. So the question that I had was around how do you make a conversation or podcast interview meaningful and valuable? Like how do you keep it on topic? How do you ask the right questions? How do you what do you got to do to make it an awesome podcast interview?
Yeah, so I highlighted before, really bank on listening. It's going to feel scary because you won't know the next question you're going to ask. But the only way you're going to get through that is to listen and pick up on what your person you're talking to is saying. And that will allow you to think of the next question. The tricky bit is you might think of the question, then it might leave your brain. So that is a skill. That is why I say like jumping on a Zoom and having a chat with somebody is a good training ground for that before you buy all the gear. I guess the second thing is like make sure it's something you want to talk about. That's something that's not just trendy at the moment. You might want to talk about finance and mortgages, but if that's not your passion, how are you going to sustain a 20-minute chat on that? So like really go through what is it that I love. So for me, on my own podcast, I worked out that what my parents gave me, and as I referenced before, was a high level of optimism. It takes a lot to break my level of optimism. And that is from everything I laid out, that's actually worked against me in life, where I think everything can be beautiful, but of course it can't. There is a balance there. But that's my view of the world, and I want to know where other people find optimism in their world. So that's my podcast. And I can talk for hours about that, and that guides my questions, So if you're your story, we might talk about, what are the things that helped you believe that when you had the bad run with a boss, that you could do your own thing, and you'll have an answer to that. And then if I listen carefully, I will be able to ask my next question, And that's not always easy. If you interview someone of influence, you're nervous, and also you want to do a good job, and that clouds your mind. So that's why it's easy to talk with a friend, because there's not the expectation there, and that will help you build up. Like if your first podcast is with the Prime Minister, it's going to be very scary because it's not just the chat. You got the Secret Service people coming in or whatever they're called. You've got to have all your questions for the comms team, and the stakes are higher. If you base it around more low stakes and build to that high stakes, I think you'll have a better outcome. I also think there's something that you won't know until you're in a chat, which is a beautiful human side, human magic. You know, like I said, I think when the heart rates are syncing, like I was talking about, syncing up together, you reach a level of trust. And then you can start really exploring other parts that you didn't think you would talk about. And that has to come through trust. So, you know, having a couple questions, when I work with students or people, I'd say maybe just like have an idea of writing your bio for the podcast. What do you think it is? You know, and you probably have an idea of your podcast and I have an idea of mine, and give it a name. You know, so let's take my podcast, A Beacon of Hope, and then my bio, you know, Beacon of Hope is a weekly podcast that shines a light on the human spirit. I can remember that far, and that kind of guides me, you know, sharing stories from unique individuals about where they find hope and optimism, something like that. And so that should inform the kind of guests I want to talk to. That should inform the kind of questions I want to ask. But I don't really write heaps. I might write a couple notes, you know. It just depends how you like to prepare. If you're someone who likes to prepare by having everything done, do that. If you're someone like me who likes to see how to wiggle themselves out of a corner by the questions they asked, and it's not foolproof either way. You know, one of the dangers about having all your questions written out is that you may make the other person feel like they're being interviewed. Whereas I think the goal for a podcast should be two parties having a conversation, you know. So, yeah, it's really tricky, but I hope there's some bit of gold in there for people listening.
Yeah, some great advice, some really great advice. I mean, I've got a podcast of my own as well. And sometimes you have guests who want preparation when they come onto podcasts. Different people, you know, respond differently. I've had a few people go, you know, can you give me a bunch of questions? And it's like, okay, cool, I'll prepare it. But I'll normally say, you know, yeah, here are the questions, but this is more the guideline.
That's
so,
right.
But we'll go off the flow in terms of the conversation. So, I mean, like with yourself, I sent through the questions, but I'm really looking at it, just going with where the conversation is going. But
however, these are good questions, and if there are if there's anything that you think are really needing to be covered, I'm absolutely keen to, you know, because the problem with me is my answers will be longer, because, you know, that is a podcast, you know, like we're under no time limits in some ways, and that's the unique part and the difference. In the past, it cost a lot to make things, you know, for the technology, for the technical skill, and for the like tape, you know, you had to load tapes in, and now we've got these, you know, fancy cameras, and they got little cards in them, and you can just go for it. So, you know, I think if we're smart, we should really double down and just have fun.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I appreciate that. You've provided a lot of value so far and answered a lot of the questions ahead. I guess from a business perspective, what are some benefits that podcasting can provide for a business? You know, like how can it help them grow their brand, influence, get more clients, improve, you know, what's the ROI there?
So I'm still trying to work that out, you know, because there's part of the tension I feel is, you know, let's hope that we all work hard so it all works out. What's going to be remembered of you in the next 20 years is the latest version of you with all your wins. What will most likely be forgotten is you trying to make it work in the early days. And I think that's where podcasting can have an archive of your story, can see you on your grind, can talk to you when you are still vulnerable in certain areas that you may not be in 20 years' time. So I would say, especially Māori Pacific, we should get used to investing in having an archive of our story, because that isn't the case if you look at who owns the current archive, which is places like TVNZ and TV3. It's mostly centered around European lens. That's a problem for me, you know? That's a problem for me when you look at some of the measurements around Pacific languages being lost. They don't have to be. We could podcast them today, but it's like there's so much baggage that we have to cloak it in. It has to be a Pacific celebration and needs to be a form. No, just start talking and start recording. Then upload it to AI and have it held so that there can be apps that a young person can say, can you translate what phone is in Cook Island? And so you can hear that. And then how can I use that in a sentence? And AI can tell you, that's what I think needs to be done. And that the data of the AI is owned by Pacific stakeholders. I think that should be definitely one of the things. So that's the kind of level I think in terms of the ROI. But I guess in more traditional terms, I would say it makes sense if you're a founder that you celebrate your current clients and that you try and build new clients. And a podcast is an awesome way to do it. You can wait to the end of the quarter and take everyone for dinner. That's a good way to do it too. You can take everyone on a fishing trip. That's a cool way to do it. Or you could really give your time and patience and learn about your customer's story. Listen to their answers. That's one, useful for the data of their customer journey. But two, a deeper relationship will form. I think that's a worthy investment of having a deeper relationship for people who are doing business with you. That's what I'm stoked about today, because like our relationship is, you come into the studio, you've got a guest, you have to give your attention to them. It's not my role as the facilitator to try and take more of your time than necessary. I'm trying to keep the environment safe and moving, But today we get to spend time together. Who knows what plants will flourish or seeds are planted because of our time spent for an hour. And that's the genius, right? It's not like we're here for 6 hours together. We're here for a very empowered, intense hour of connection. And I think like many awesome things can come out of that. So that's just talking about the connection. Then you have the content side. If you're onto it and you have a little bit of digital skills, you can take your full podcast, you can make clips, you can leverage AI to make the clips. It's not easy. None of this stuff's easy. And you will be frustrated because it's hard to translate sometimes and you got to spend time and it's a never-ending rabbit hole. But I'm of the opinion that I don't have a huge follower base. I don't have huge amount of likes when I post something. But more than not, people are like, oh, you're the podcast person, Will. And I've heard about you through this person. So I think it's the return on investment for me has been I'm known as a very stable podcast producer. And I think that's great. You can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to have that reputation. And I've built that in a very organic way. So people may not like my post, but they definitely see oh, there's that dude again posting another one of his clips. And I think that's cool. That's how we should be leveraging our own content just to build our reputation. And the true test is, if you want to put a really strict measurement on it, then you have to put money into that. You may want to invest in getting the podcast professionally recorded. You may want to invest in getting it edited really nicely and then invest in a budget to boost it. I always laugh because massive films like Avatar, they still have a massive budget for promotion. If it was just about making awesome stuff and you didn't need a budget, there would be no $50 million budget for a movie to be boosted everywhere in the world, but that's not the case. So I don't like the pay-to-play conversation because we're just little blips, But when it comes to our richness and content, dude, we're at the high end, There won't be too many other conversations happening right now in Pookie, where we are, than right now. And that's a very powerful space for us to be in.
That podcasting, what it can do for businesses, you could use it as a tool or vehicle to connect with potential clients. You'd be like, even if you're not doing business or partnership with them, you'd be like, hey, I love the work that you're doing. I love your story. I'd love to get you on our podcast. Then you build that relationship and that connection there. And who knows where it could lead to. But at least you've extracted a lot of good knowledge and you're learning from them as well.
Yep.
Provide a lot of value. Or you could bring your existing clients and celebrate their stories.
Yep.
Like, hey, what's been some awesome impact and some positive
100%.
Transformation. Let's share, let's inspire other people. So I love that.
It's fair. It's fair. And it's not manipulative. It's way more manipulative to take people out on some interesting thing and expect them to be your clients, you know? That's why I joked about you at the start. We don't have the golf clubs to go to. People think they're there to play golf. I suspect they're there to have connection and cut deals. I want to do the same on a podcast. We can do both. We can have awesome chats, build in to be friends, and then when the time's right, cut our deals together. And why not? Why can't we have a strong network? You know, I don't want to be fighting with other Pacific content creators. In fact, that is the way it goes at the moment. There's a certain amount of funding that comes out and everyone has to tender for it. Why does it have to be that way? It's not that way in other things. We think that's silly to do that, but I think it's because, you know, we're still trying to find our way in this modern world, and it's going to take me and you working together, sharing clients, building networks together, being on each other's podcasts, and I really think that's going to be a good, you know, thing for us in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, and I still think podcasting is still somewhat new.
Yep.
Not a lot of people understand the true power or know how to leverage it.
Yep.
A lot of people are starting, but they don't know how to take it further. I mean, you're ahead a lot of people that I know of personally. But even from our personal experience, we've got another podcast for education, and we you know, we're in our 30s now in terms of episodes, which is, you know, we're happy. I mean, it was hard.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a bit of a big break, but we got there eventually. But anyway, we've got clients on there, or me and Kalolo would my brother would have a podcast interview together, and we just share our thoughts on trends, on anything that's important and relevant. And it's helped our brand establish thought leadership.
Boom.
And people, we get this time and time again, even, you know, when we meet them for the first time online, they're like, hey, I've listened to your podcast. I love what you guys are all about. I want to work with you guys. Yeah. You know, so even before the initial meet and greet, they've already been influenced, or they've learned about us through our podcast. We had one client who shared the podcast or one of the episodes with her whole business, everyone at work. Perfect. And they were all listening to it at work. And it was one of the podcasts we recorded at your studio too, which is awesome. And you know, that's, yeah, we might not see the immediate impact and ROI of podcasts, but if you stay consistent, like you said, eventually people will benefit from it and reach out to you, knock on your door instead of you knocking on their doors.
Yep.
You know, it does so much. Hey.
It's the same as, you know, the modern one is, should we go for a coffee? You know, that is an investment too. But no one breaks down the ROI because you can't expect that. But it is a really simple way to network. You know, coffee is just affordable, that it makes sense, and, you know, but I deeply think that there's lots of distractions. You know, maybe that's part of it too. Who are you seen with? But the podcast has the same ego thing. You know, it's a hierarchy-free zone where if you don't know someone that well, you can still say, can we do a podcast? You know, boom. And then it's about the topic. Oh, what are we going to talk about? Yeah, sweet. And then the true thing is, like, you've really given yourself an hour to get to know someone. But you can't say it like that, eh? You can't say, hey, Pussy, I'd like to get to know you a bit better. Can we just catch up? Everyone will be like, oh, sorry, bro, busy. You know, but it's like, bro, can we do a podcast? And we can talk about this stuff. And it's like, yeah, man. And, like, that's how friendships are made. You know, when we had times to play with our friends, you were doing something, playing cricket or kicking the ball around. And guess what? You were having little jokes on the side, and that was forming that connection. But we've totally forgotten. And so, you know, it's an awesome strategy that I truly think every business should have a podcast. And so, you know, that's not easy to work the logistics of that out, but it is a necessary feature. You know, imagine if managers could podcast with their staff. You might subvert some of the dramas we talked about by just sitting down and listening to your staff. You know, and actually, who's not going to say that's not awesome content by having someone in a more powerful position talking to other people? You know, that's the measurement I put on, or the algorithm I use for the students that I work with. Talk to the person who you think is the most powerful person you know. And guaranteed in that podcast environment, they'll be kind of a bit scared. You know, the cameras are on, so they'll behave themselves. and they won't bring that same level of power over you. And there's a very nice equalizer there.
I love that. Do you have any stories? Because I know you work with a lot of clients and you produce like 400 podcasts. Do you have any good client stories, or one that you could share around how podcasting has helped them?
Yeah, I got two examples that come to mind. My first funded client. So I do some funded work with PBT or Pacific Business Trust, and that's actually how we made your podcast possible. Sione is his name, and he has a podcast called Organic Talanoa, and we can share that to you. He did 2 seasons of his podcast funded, and we were sitting down one day, and I said, "Man, are you really proud of yourself?" He's like, "Oh, dude, it's awesome." And he said he got all of his phone calls and text messages when people sent him. They said, "We would have never imagined you out of everyone would have a podcast." And I said, "Why is that, bro?" And he said, "Because I wasn't known as the talker in our groups. I was the listener. I was the support person. I was the laugher. But I had something to say the whole time, but other people kept filling that space. And the gift that the podcast gave him is it allowed him to share his voice." And I was like, that's so wild, because when you came in here, I never knew that about you. And it never looked that way when you had your podcast. But isn't that interesting that there are those of us who have to kind of suppress our voice to be part of the wider group? Maybe there's someone naturally who just takes that space. But I thought that was so interesting that, he's now in a small elite group of Aotearoa-based podcasters who's walked the walk. He's interviewed all sorts of people, and they've had deep and rich conversations. The other example is one of the students that I did a podcast with. She interviewed an elder in her community, and I saw that elder a few weeks ago, and I said, "Hey, remember we did that podcast, and thanks so much for that." And that lady said to me, "Guess what? Every week, me and that student still catch up for sushi since that podcast." And I was like, what a wild outcome to know that they had 1 hour of time together. And since that, every week they catch up for sushi. These are like some of the biggest, if you look at funding and all that type of stuff, they always have the same pillars: connectivity, equity. It's like these are being delivered simply by having these chats. And I'm not saying it's a solution for everything, but man, I think wherever we find temptation to make things about PowerPoint presentations or reports or Google Docs, say to yourself, could those be podcasts? You get a deeper, richer outcome, and it should tick a box as a report. And that's what I'm trying to build towards, How can companies come together for these rich conversations? And that can deliver on team building. Don't take me fishing. Learn about me by having a deep, rich talanoa with me, and I will share with you my insights, my worldview, and together we might find a place of harmony.
I like that. What's great experiences. I bet that's just some of many that you have.
Yep.
But what I'm hearing is, it helps the people who host the podcast to grow themselves.
That's right.
And it builds long-lasting relationships like the one with the sushi.
Yeah.
Which is pretty awesome.
Bro, it's totally it's wild. I thought it to be true, but I didn't know that it was. I just knew how I felt when I was podcasting, and I thought it would be true if you bring people together. So my role really now is like just try and do small talk, keep people focused on the podcast. Hopefully we gave you that feeling when you came to the studio. It's like, the stakes are quite high. You're already probably carrying a bit of nervousness. But it's like, it's okay, bro. We're just having a chat. You sit there, anyone want to drink? Cool, we're going to hit record. And all of a sudden we're off. If you make it a big thing, okay, everyone quiet now. You can't do it like that. It has to be more human than that. So that's what we try and do. And then just like this chat, 20 minutes in, you forget the mic's there, this camera's recording, and you're just talking with a pal. It's awesome.
Yeah, I love that. And from a business owner perspective, someone who likes to be efficient and who likes to be like five birds, one stone type of approach. You can use the podcast, like you said, and it's a nice way to network with people, which is good. It's a nice way to create content. You can take that, use AI, and break it down into multiple content for marketing purposes, or there's so much with it. I guess just, as we draw closer and wrap up the podcast here, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Once someone has got their podcast and, they've got momentum, the other part of it is promoting it, so it does reach people. So you do have actually listeners, people listening to the podcast. You're not just producing it for thin air. How do you, promote your podcast? How do you get it out there?
Yeah, it's tricky. I won't lie. There's no magic AI for that. What I would try and say is aim towards, like you would say to a teenager, you'd say, try and have a shower regularly, right? Try and upload a podcast regular. Try and find a small portion of that podcast, which is a golden nugget, and share that as a social media clip. Maybe say to yourself, for 4 weeks, I'm going to try and do one podcast a week and one small clip a week. If you're a business which has a bit of resource, that should be manageable. If you're a solo entrepreneur, then that's going to take a little bit of guts, and it's going to take a little bit of concentration. But if you can do that for 4 weeks, then you tell yourself, this is something interesting. You don't know who's watching. You don't know who's clicking. You don't know who's liking. Try not to burden yourself with going viral. Try to burden yourself with one a week for 4 weeks, and then see how you feel. If you can keep it up, do another 4 weeks, and if you think, oh man, that's easy, then do 2 short clips in the second month. So for me, as someone who's pretty busy, you're the same, our phones have been ringing, people are hunting for us, but I try and do 1 podcast a week, and I try and do 1 or 2 short social media clips a week. And that's how I try and get my stuff out there. But, it's tricky. You're probably only going to get a few downloads, maybe if you're lucky, 100, 200, 300. There's lots of content out there. There's something like 800,000 podcasts in the world. So we're just a dot on the blip. But that's okay, because the connections we have is what you're aiming for. If I've properly framed this whole podcast up, you're actually not starting a podcast so you can go viral. You're starting a podcast to tell your story, to invite others to tell theirs, and to build really strong relationships so you can keep learning and keep networking and hopefully keep working for ourselves.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your advice. You've blessed us, left us better than when you came in here with so much rich knowledge. And hopefully some entrepreneurs and business owners out there have gotten some good value around podcasting, why it's so important, some good ROI on it, and what it can do to help grow your brand, your business. I think just before we finish, is there any final words that you want to share with people out there as a fellow business owner, fellow entrepreneur?
Just thank you, to have a space I can come and be vulnerable like this and say, I don't have all the answers. And just because I like podcasting doesn't make me a good business owner. I'm learning as I go. And I think that a podcast is an amazing way to be able to be vulnerable. And today you've allowed that, and you've made this space pleasurable to be in. I think we achieved our talanoa, which is a conversation that ends or has harmony. I feel that, and just want to thank you for letting us build our relationship. And it's exciting to be pals with you because we're motivated.
Yeah.
And the stakes are high. We've got families and we need to earn dollars, and we want to do it in our way. And we can't really look left and right. We just got to look forward, and the people who want to come with us, let's do it, So that's my message. Don't worry about KPIs, make your own KPIs. And my one is I want to work with people that I want to work with on my terms, or I want to be able to say no. And so I'm trying to aim high and be nice to my family as the stress rolls in. And just power to you.
I love it. Thank you so much. Some really good final words here from Will Fleming, founder of Campfire Studios. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, brother.